she'll never show. Women like her don't survive humiliation twice. That was the bet whispered over champagne. But Violet Taylor didn't need permission to exist in the rooms she built. While they rehearsed their laughter, she rehearsed her calm. When the doors opened, she didn't walk in for revenge. She walked in as proof that grace could level empires. And by the time they realized what they'd invited, the joke wasn't on her. It was on every hand that tried to erase her. Stay with us. Because what began as a cruel invitation became a night no one would forget. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. Have you ever turned someone's doubt into your grand entrance? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Black Stories Untold with Love, and ring that notification bell for more heartwarming stories that celebrate strength. The invitation lay on the marble table like a challenge dressed in gold. The paper was thick enough to hold weight, the kind reserved for names that mattered. Its edges shimmered faintly in the soft Manhattan light that poured through the tall windows of Violet Taylor's apartment overlooking Central Park. Morning had painted the city in silver and amber, but her world was still a quiet expanse of stillness and intent. She sat before the letter without touching it, the faint steam of untouched coffee rising beside her. She had been waiting for something like this, though she had not known it until now. Her hand moved at last, graceful and deliberate. The envelope gave a soft sound as she opened it, the kind of silence that follows expensive paper. The embossed lettering revealed itself with cruel simplicity, the Miles Foundation Gala. She knew it instantly. Once, she had stood at the center of that night. She had chosen the flowers, the menu, even the music that played as donors drifted beneath chandeliers. Her name had been printed beside her husband's on every guest list. Now it was not printed at all, only written by another hand and sent to her apartment like a test of how much dignity she still owned. The name at the bottom was missing, but she knew its origin. That was part of the design. Sage Miles was a man who understood the language of power. He did not need to sign what was already his. The invitation was not a gesture of reconciliation. It was a provocation wrapped in formality, the kind of move only the wealthy could disguise as civility. She imagined the laughter in the boardroom where it had been discussed, the careful smirks of people who thought they knew her breaking point. Outside, the city was already alive. Horns echoed from Fifth Avenue, mingling with the rhythm of heels on pavement and the far-off wail of an ambulance. Violet remained still. Her gaze drifted to the skyline, the glass towers catching the morning sun like blades. For years, she had lived among those towers, moving through them like a current of quiet authority. She had been admired, envied, studied. Her presence could fill a room without effort, her silence more commanding than most speeches. That power had been hers once, and for a long time she had mistaken it for belonging. When the scandal came, it was swift and surgical. Headlines spoke in the language of betrayal and spectacle. The divorce was public, the narrative cruelly simple. He was rebuilding. She was unraveling. No one saw that she had already begun to rebuild long before they finished speaking her name. Her exile had been her education. She learned that solitude could be a kind of strength, that the absence of applause was not the absence of worth. She reached for the invitation again, her fingertips tracing the letters as if to measure the intent behind them. The paper was cold, its texture both exquisite and impersonal. For a long moment she watched the sunlight move across the words, gilding them with the kind of beauty that had always been her armor. Then she placed it back on the table with the same care she used to place diamonds in a velvet case. Her reflection in the glass window met her gaze with quiet certainty. The corners of her mouth lifted, not in amusement but in acknowledgement of something inevitable. Let them. There had been a time when their names were spoken together like a brand, Sage and Violet, the power couple who could silence a room with their arrival. Every gala, every charity ball, every headline carried a photograph of them framed in perfection. He was the visionary billionaire whose intellect could turn failing companies into gold. She was the woman who made power look like poetry, whose kindness disarmed rivals, and whose elegance softened the edges of his ambition. Together, they were the embodiment of balance. The empire he built became the empire she refined. Their home in the Hamptons had been a monument to that unity. White stone walls, glass that reflected the sea, gardens sculpted to mirror her precision. Violet remembered the quiet mornings when they stood at opposite ends of the terrace, sipping coffee in silence that felt like understanding. They rarely spoke about love because they believed it was visible. In the way his hand found hers during speeches, in the way her laughter cut through the formality of business dinners. Their affection existed not in grand gestures, but in rhythm, in the unspoken harmony of two people who had once believed they were invincible. But empires have fault lines, and theirs began with whispers. It started with a rumor in a column, a suggestion that his attention had shifted. Violet ignored it at first. She had seen rumors before, had even laughed at them when they targeted others. Yet this one clung to her like smoke that refused to fade. Photographs appeared of Sage at late-night meetings, smiling beside women whose faces blurred under flashbulbs. There was nothing incriminating, only implication. And implication was enough to turn admiration into suspicion. The press adored her downfall. They called her the perfect wife until they decided she was the problem. Too proud, too silent, too unwilling to play the part of the wounded woman begging for sympathy. The narrative rewrote itself overnight. He was the misunderstood genius. She was the burden who did not understand ambition. Sage stopped correcting them. Whether it was self-preservation or guilt, she never knew. He retreated behind his empire, answering every question with another acquisition, every scandal with another press release. Violet refused to perform her pain. She attended one last event, her gown immaculate, her poise untouchable. Cameras captured her stepping out of the car with the same composure she had always carried, but the warmth in her eyes had cooled into something distant. She smiled, spoke kindly, and then disappeared from their world altogether. The gossip columnists called it retreat. They did not know it was rebirth. In the quiet months that followed, her absence became its own kind of legend. She moved into a smaller apartment overlooking the park, filled it with silence and books and art that spoke without words. She no longer attended openings or appeared in society pages. She learned to exist without an audience. She studied herself the way one studies a scar, not to erase it, but to understand what had healed. The city still whispered her name, but she stopped listening. By the time the invitation arrived years later, the world had almost forgotten her. Almost. The boardroom was made of marble and mirrors, a place where wealth reflected itself endlessly. The table gleamed beneath the soft light, polished to perfection, just like the people seated around it. The afternoon meeting had stretched long past its purpose, the kind of gathering where conversation drifted easily from numbers to gossip because power loved to amuse itself. At the head sat Sage Miles, sleeves rolled to his forearms, his focus sharp on the documents before him. His voice, when he spoke, still carried that quiet authority that made people lean forward without realizing why. Across from him sat Isla Kensington, the new partner whose beauty was as deliberate as her ambition. Her laughter had a way of filling the spaces where silence should have been. They had been reviewing final details for the annual Miles Foundation Gala, a tradition built under Sage and Violet's joint vision years ago. The gala had once been a symbol of their unity, a blend of business and benevolence that turned charity into prestige. Now, It existed as a monument to what had been lost. The planning committee debated the guest list, the entertainment, the menu. Everything was routine until Isla leaned back in her chair, eyes glinting with something playful and sharp. "We should invite Violet." The words slipped out like a whisper coated in sugar, for old time's sake. The room stilled, then erupted in restrained laughter. Not the kind born from humor, but from shared cruelty dressed as wit. Someone murmured that it would certainly make headlines, that a touch of drama could elevate publicity. Another joked that perhaps she would not even recognize half the people now. The laughter swelled, polite and poisonous. It moved through the room like expensive perfume, pleasant to the senses, deadly underneath. Sage did not laugh. He did not look up either. His jaw tightened slightly, his pen pausing above the page. He knew this was what they wanted, to see if he would flinch, if he still carried a trace of the woman whose shadow once softened his edges. Isla watched him with quiet satisfaction, her lips curving just enough to register triumph. She enjoyed testing boundaries, especially those that once belonged to someone else. Someone suggested that the invitation be sent without a signature. It would look neutral, professional, almost thoughtful. The detail drew a round of approval. The decision was made as easily as the choice of wine for the evening. To them, Violet was no longer a person, only a story. An elegant ghost that might as well appear for one more performance. Sage finally spoke, his tone even, his eyes still fixed on the table. If that is what the board decides, no protest, no defense. The conversation moved on. The laughter returned, and soon they were talking about lighting, press coverage, and menu options as if they had not just reduced a woman's dignity to entertainment. When the meeting ended, Isla lingered. She placed a manicured hand on Sage's arm, her touch light, possessive. "You did the right thing," she said softly, but there was something in his silence that unsettled her. He left without responding. Later that night, long after the city had dimmed into quiet, the invitation was printed on ivory paper. Thick, perfect, unsigned. A gesture polished into cruelty. By morning, it would be sealed in gold and on its way to a woman they thought had vanished. They did not realize that what they were sending was not an invitation. It was a spark. The invitation remained on her desk for 3 days, untouched, yet impossible to ignore. Its gold edges caught the light each morning, gleaming like something alive, a reminder that the past still had the arrogance to reach for her. Violet moved around it as though it were fragile, though she knew better than to mistake elegance for fragility. The envelope sat among her sketches and correspondence, too deliberate to be forgotten. Each time she passed, her gaze lingered just long enough to feel its weight in the air. Her assistant, Clara, was the first to break the silence. She found Violet standing by the window, the skyline burning in the reflection of dusk. "You do not owe them this," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Violet only smiled, that soft, unreadable smile she had perfected over years of scrutiny. She did not answer. She didn't need to. The city stretched out before her, endless and indifferent, yet something inside her had begun to move again. The calls came next. Friends, old acquaintances, even one reporter cloaked in the disguise of concern. They all carried the same warning. Do not go. Do not give them another story. Let them think you are above it. Their advice was well-meaning, but Violet heard the fear behind it. The fear that she would expose how easily silence can become submission. For years, she had obeyed the unspoken rule of exile. Stay quiet, stay graceful, fade politely. But time had turned their pity into something brittle. She had been quiet long enough. On the 4th morning, she walked to the table and opened the envelope again. The paper felt the same as it had before, smooth and deliberate, but this time it no longer held power over her. She folded it once, precisely, and placed it beside a garment bag tucked deep inside her wardrobe. The gown within had been hidden for years, wrapped in white tissue like a memory she had refused to revisit. She unzipped the cover slowly, revealing bronze silk that caught the morning light like fire through glass. She ran her fingers over the fabric, tracing the seams she once wore with pride. It was not nostalgia that stirred her, it was reclamation. Clara appeared in the doorway again, hesitation in her voice. "You are really going?" Violet nodded. "They expect my absence. That is why I will go." Her tone was calm, but beneath it pulsed something steady and unyielding. It was not anger, it was resolve. She did not want a confrontation. She wanted clarity, the kind that only presence could bring. As night settled over the city, she stood before the mirror. The woman who looked back was familiar yet changed, softer in some places, sharper in others. She no longer looked like someone who needed to belong. The reflection held her gaze with quiet power, as if acknowledging an agreement made long ago and finally honored. Violet reached for her earrings, small and gold, the same ones she had worn the night the world first decided to turn against her. She fastened them one by one, her movements unhurried, deliberate. In the silence that followed, she felt it, the calm before a storm she no longer feared. She was not returning to their world for vengeance. She was returning as a reminder that she had never truly left it. The moment she entered, the room forgot its rhythm. Music drifted on, polite and practiced, but the air beneath the chandeliers shifted. Violet Taylor stood framed by the doorway, the light catching on the soft shimmer of her gown. The fabric was the color of midnight brushed with stars, each step releasing a quiet glint that followed her like devotion. She didn't rush. The stillness that followed her arrival was its own kind of ceremony, and she moved through it with a calm that bordered on defiance. The conversations that had once filled the room with hollow laughter began to fragment. Champagne flutes stilled in midair. People who had spent years pretending to forget her name now spoke it behind cupped hands. The orchestra continued to play, unaware that they had become background to a moment that no one present would ever quite forget. Violet had been the absence they once mocked, the silence they mistook for surrender. Now she was presence made flesh. At the far end of the ballroom, Sage Miles stood surrounded by men in tailored suits and women in sequins that caught the light like glass. His hand rested loosely on a glass of whiskey, his expression carved in the restraint of someone who had long mastered the art of control. Yet when his eyes found her, all that polish fractured. The conversation around him faded into nothing. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. Violet's gaze swept across the room, not searching but claiming. Her posture was straight, her shoulders open, her chin lifted in quiet command. It wasn't pride, it was peace, something that looked like it had taken years to earn. She moved with the slow grace of a tide returning to a shore that had once rejected it. She greeted people she remembered, offered nods to those who once looked through her. Every smile was measured, every word spoken with deliberate softness that unsettled more than anger ever could. Isla Kensington watched from near the stage, her champagne untouched. Her beauty was sharp, her expression sharper still. She leaned toward one of the guests, whispering something that earned a nervous laugh, but her eyes never left Violet. When their gazes met, it was fleeting yet electric, the kind of meeting that said everything words would ruin. Isla's smirk faltered first. Violet crossed the marble floor until she stood beneath the chandelier's center light. The crystals above her caught the faint glow of her gown and threw it back in fragments across the crowd. She seemed untouched by the weight of so many eyes, Every move she made carried an ease that came not from arrogance, but from survival. She had faced worse storms than whispers. Across the room, Sage set his glass down. For a second, their eyes locked again. Two lives suspended in an unspoken truth. Whatever love had existed between them was no longer tender, but it was not gone either. It lived now as memory, heavy but dignified. Violet offered him a small, graceful nod before turning away. The crowd began to breathe again, but the energy had changed. The gala was no longer theirs to command. It belonged, however briefly, to her. Violet didn't need to raise her voice or reclaim her name. Simply by standing there, by refusing to disappear, she reminded them all that grace was not silence. It was power, perfected. The gala had found its rhythm again, but it was not the same as before. Conversations flowed, laughter returned, and yet an invisible thread tied every movement back to her. Violet had become the center of the room's gravity. Guests hovered near her orbit, pulled by curiosity and discomfort in equal measure. Some came armed with compliments, their smiles too polished to be sincere. Others approached with questions disguised as interest. How have you been keeping busy? Are you still involved in charity? Each word was dipped in subtle venom, but Violet's replies were smooth and measured, her tone warm enough to disarm and cool enough to keep them guessing. Every gesture she made carried the ease of someone who refused to be cornered. Her laughter, soft and deliberate, rippled through the air and unsettled the people who once believed they had written her ending. She was a mirror now, reflecting them back at themselves with grace that made their pettiness visible. Even the orchestra seemed to adjust to her presence, their music shifting to a slower rhythm, the strings echoing the pulse of something both regal and restrained. Isla Kensington moved toward her like a shadow that had waited for the right light. She wore white silk, her gown crisp and severe, her beauty immaculate but cold. The crowd seemed to part for her, sensing what was coming. When she reached Violet, she extended a crystal flute filled with champagne, her smile perfectly composed. "You are brave to show up," she said, her tone sweet enough to draw attention. The nearby guests fell silent, pretending to look elsewhere while listening to every word. Violet turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Isla's with calm precision. Her hand brushed against the glass but did not take it. "Why would I fear a room I helped build?" Her voice was soft, but it carried. The words hung between them like velvet lined with steel. The laughter that followed was nervous, the kind of laughter that tried to diffuse what it could not deny. Isla's smile flickered. Sage, watching from a few feet away, felt something twist in his chest. He had seen Violet perform before, on stages of philanthropy, at dinners where power disguised itself as generosity, but never like this. This was not performance. This was reclamation. She moved through the room not as a guest, but as someone reclaiming what had been taken. Not love, not status, but presence. Every polite exchange became a small act of rebellion. She did not confront. She dismantled, word by word, glance by glance. Sage's eyes followed her as she drifted through the crowd, every detail of her composure exposing what his silence had cost. He realized too late that she was not fighting to be accepted again. She had outgrown the need. Isla tried to resume her laughter, but the balance of the room had shifted. Even the people who had joined in her earlier cruelty now turned toward Violet with hesitant admiration. Violet's smile never faltered. She did not stay long in any conversation, did not linger for validation. She moved as if guided by rhythm only she could hear. Around her, the guests adjusted, unsure whether to bow to her grace or retreat from the truth it revealed. For the first time that evening, the whispers quieted, and the Miles Foundation Gala no longer belonged to its hosts. It belonged to the woman they had tried to erase, who stood before them not as a memory, but as the measure of their own smallness. Dinner unfolded beneath chandeliers that dripped light like liquid gold. The table stretched endlessly, dressed in white linen and crystal that caught every flicker of the candles. Voices rose and fell in well-practiced tones, laughter spilling at predictable intervals. It was the kind of laughter that came not from joy but from habit, a sound meant to remind the room of its own refinement. Violet sat halfway down the table, the scent of roses and truffle lingering in the air, her posture flawless, her expression unreadable. Sage presided at the head, his glass poised delicately between his fingers. His voice carried easily across the hall as he spoke of tradition, of success, of legacy. Every phrase was polished, rehearsed, stripped of sentiment. It was the speech of a man who understood audiences better than emotion. Violet watched him without resentment, without longing. What she felt was quieter, deeper, an understanding of how far she had traveled from the woman who once sat beside him, completing his sentences with a smile. The orchestra played softly, the low hum of strings floating beneath the conversation. Silver cutlery clinked against porcelain, and the air shimmered with the illusion of harmony. Yet beneath it, something tense and electric waited to unfold. Isla's laughter cut through the hum, sharp and deliberate. She leaned forward, her voice just loud enough to carry. "And let us not forget second chances," she said, her eyes gleaming toward Violet. The room froze for a heartbeat. Then the laughter returned, lower now, edged with something cruel and expectant. Violet did not move. The sound reached her like a wave breaking far from shore. She let it wash over her, felt it lose its power before it even arrived. Her hand rested lightly on her napkin, her fingers tracing the edge of the fabric. When the laughter finally dimmed, she placed it neatly beside her plate and rose. The motion was slow, deliberate, effortless. The orchestra faltered, then silenced itself, the bowstrings hovering in midair. Every face turned toward her. She met their gazes with the calm certainty of someone who had walked through fire and learned to carry its light. Her glass lifted from the table, steady in her hand. For a moment, she said nothing. Only the faint hiss of candle flame filled the air. Then softly, she spoke. Indeed, the single word floated through the stillness, settling like a promise. She raised her glass higher. To the women who become the lesson after being the foundation. The words struck cleanly, each syllable wrapped in grace but carrying the precision of truth. The room stayed silent, caught between admiration and guilt. Even Isla's face, still curved in its practiced smile, faltered slightly as though the mask had grown too heavy. Sage's hand tightened around his glass, the faintest tremor visible before he caught himself. Violet's eyes swept the table once, taking in the glitter of jewels, the tight smiles, the shifting discomfort. She did not wait for applause. She sipped her champagne slowly, her movements measured, controlled. Then she sat down again, her gaze serene, her power reclaimed without noise or permission. The room exhaled only after she had finished. The orchestra began to play once more, quieter now, as if the music itself had learned respect. For a moment, the silence after her toast felt endless. It stretched across the table, fragile and suspended, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The orchestra had stopped entirely now, the last note dissolving into the air like smoke. Violet remained standing, the soft glow from the chandeliers catching the shimmer of her gown. She had not raised her voice, yet it filled every corner of the hall with a quiet authority that demanded attention. When she spoke again, her tone carried not the weight of anger, but the calm of someone who had already made peace with the truth. "Grace," she began, "is often mistaken for weakness." The words were gentle, deliberate, every syllable precise. But grace is not silence. It is strength made still. Her eyes moved slowly across the table, meeting each gaze without wavering. She spoke not just to the faces watching her, but to the years of whispers that had tried to shape her story. Loyalty, she continued, is not blindness. It is belief in something worth standing beside, even when the world confuses stillness with surrender. Her tone did not tremble. It deepened, carrying something warm and alive. The crowd listened in complete stillness. Glasses hovered, forks paused. The servants along the walls had stopped moving entirely. She did not accuse. She did not seek sympathy. She simply laid out truth like fine glass on a table, fragile, transparent, and impossible to ignore. I have learned that starting over is not a punishment, she said softly. It is an act of courage, especially when the world would rather watch your fall than your rise. Her words were both confession and revelation, wrapped in a poise that no scandal could touch. At the head of the table, Sage's glass trembled slightly before he set it down. His gaze held her, and in that moment, the past seemed to unfold silently between them. The triumphs, the betrayals, the distance that had never been filled by anyone else. He understood that she was not speaking to him, yet every word pierced through the armor he had built. Across from him, Isla shifted in her seat. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, her eyes darting toward the cameras she had once called herself ready for. They were still, their lenses unblinking, capturing what no one had expected. A woman rising without permission, unafraid to speak in a room built to silence her. Violet let her words linger just long enough to settle before finishing. Some of us were never invited to destroy legacies. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the golden light and polished faces. We were invited to remind them what integrity sounds like. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, thick with recognition, with the sound of masks cracking beneath the weight of truth. Then, slowly, the first sound came. The soft chime of a spoon against glass. A single clap. Another. The applause grew, hesitant but genuine, spreading like a wave of reluctant acknowledgement. Violet did not bow, did not smile in victory. She simply lowered her glass, her eyes calm, her shoulders steady. She had not reclaimed the room. She had transformed it. The applause began as a whisper, a polite acknowledgement forced by etiquette, not emotion. Yet something in the sound refused to stay small. It grew, slow but certain, until the entire hall seemed to move with it. Hands met in uneven rhythm, echoing through crystal and glass, breaking the brittle veneer that had hung over the evening. Some clapped because it was expected, others because they could not help it. The applause wasn't for the speech alone, it was for the unspoken truth that had finally been allowed to breathe. Violet remained standing, her posture serene, her eyes steady on the far end of the room. The candlelight painted her in warmth that felt unearned by the crowd that watched her now as though seeing her for the first time. Even those who had laughed earlier, who had traded her name for sport, avoided her gaze. The weight of their discomfort hung heavy in the air, but she did not draw satisfaction from it. Her triumph was quieter than that. At the head of the table, Sage Miles rose. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if gravity had grown heavier. The applause faltered and faded as he stepped forward. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. Years of control, of careful composure, had built him into a man who never revealed what he felt. But now the edges of that restraint had softened. His pride, once immaculate, had fractured into something more human. He stopped a few steps from her, the space between them heavy with everything left unsaid. "You didn't have to come," he murmured, his voice low enough to belong only to her. It wasn't accusation, it was confession. His eyes searched hers for a trace of the woman he used to know, the one who once completed his sentences and steadied his temper. But the woman before him now was different. She had not returned for him. Violet looked at him, calm and unflinching. "You're right. I didn't." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of release. She didn't linger for reaction or understanding. Her hand brushed the edge of the table as she turned, the faint rustle of silk marking her passage through the stillness. Heads turned as she moved, every gaze following her as though the act of watching her leave was its own reckoning. Her perfume lingered, soft and familiar, a ghost of the past suspended in the air long after she had gone. Sage stood where she left him, surrounded by the remnants of applause and the faint clatter of silverware returning to rest. The room slowly exhaled, conversations resuming in hushed tones, laughter returning like an echo too timid to reclaim its earlier cruelty. He remained unmoving, his eyes fixed on the doorway she had passed through. For all the empire he commanded, for all the power that had once seemed absolute, he understood now the cost of it. Wealth could buy silence, respect, illusion, but not what she carried with her as she walked away. The calm in her shoulders, the stillness in her gaze, the freedom that did not require permission. For the first time in his life, Sage Miles envied nothing she wore, nothing she had said. He envied only what he could never possess again, the peace that comes from knowing you owe the world nothing. The night air met her like an old friend, cool and steady against the heat that lingered from the ballroom. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, horns, footsteps, laughter rising from distant streets. The world beyond those glass doors had not paused for the spectacle that had just unfolded, and that was the beauty of it. Life went on, indifferent and alive. Violet stepped onto the marble steps, her heels striking softly against the stone, each click echoing like punctuation to a story finally complete. The driver opened the car door without a word. She nodded once, slid inside, and felt the quiet wrap around her like silk. The door shut, muting the city to a gentle hum. For a moment, she sat still, her pulse slowing, her breath steadying. The earrings came off first, gold catching the dim interior light before she placed them beside her on the seat. They had always been her favorite pair, understated yet unmistakable, much like the woman she had become. She leaned her head back and exhaled, a long breath that felt years in the making. Through the tinted glass, the Grand Astoria shimmered in the distance, its chandeliers still burning against the night. It looked smaller now, framed by the skyline's expanse. A place that once seemed inescapable had become only another building, another gathering of fragile egos hidden behind polished stone. She watched as guests began to filter out, tiny figures beneath the glittering facade, their laughter carrying faintly through the glass. For years that sound had haunted her. Tonight, it sounded hollow, like echoes in an empty hall. She turned her gaze toward the city, toward the lights stretching endlessly beyond the park. It struck her how the world outside had always been there, vast, waiting, patient. She had spent so long surviving the narrowness of their approval that she had almost forgotten the expanse of her own freedom. Vindication had never been the goal. What she felt now was something gentler and far more powerful. Restoration. A quiet return to herself. Her phone buzzed once in her purse and fell silent. She did not check it. Whatever messages awaited could wait until morning. The car began to move, gliding smoothly into the stream of lights that cut through the city. The reflections in the glass shifted, the ballroom fading, her own face emerging. She studied it for a moment. The woman looking back was not the one who had arrived trembling years ago at the edge of someone else's empire. She was no longer trying to prove her worth in rooms that had already decided their hierarchy. She had built her own, unseen but solid. The city opened before her in silver and gold, each window a reminder that life continued far beyond any ballroom. Violet smiled softly, the kind of smile that did not need witnesses. Somewhere, the laughter that once targeted her still echoed, but it was distant now, reduced to something harmless. She let it fade completely as the skyline rose ahead, luminous against the dark. Queens, she thought, do not reclaim thrones. They redefine them. And as the car carried her forward, she knew that whatever came next would be hers entirely. If this story spoke to you, let it travel. Because someone out there is still convincing herself she's too broken to rise. She needs to know that elegance can be armor, and that you don't need applause to own the room. Comment below if you've ever walked back into a space that once erased you and felt the shift when the air remembered your name. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.